I'll never forget the sound of the HOA officers pounding on my metal gate. It echoed through the quiet morning like thunder. They shouted my name again and again, their voices sharp and angry. They wanted me to open the gate, but I didn't move. Instead, I stood right behind it, calm as a sleeping lake. My land stretched wide behind me, peaceful and still, and I wasn't going to let anyone push me around on it. "Open the gate!" one of them yelled. "No," I said loud and clear. "My land, my rules." The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. The HOA officers froze for a second, then they lost it. They kicked the gate. They tried twisting the lock. One of them threatened to call the sheriff. Another said they could fine me every single day for refusing to cooperate. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't step back. This was my land, and they didn't get to walk in like they owned it. And then, the craziest thing happened. Something so shocking that even I didn't expect it. But before I tell you what it was, let me take you back to where all this began. Because this fight didn't start with a locked gate, it started way, way before that. It started on a warm Saturday morning, with a simple act of kindness. Months before the shouting at the gate, life on my land was peaceful. I lived on the very edge of town, where trees whisper when the wind moves and birds sing like they're practicing for a concert. My land wasn't fancy, but it was mine. My grandpa left it to me, and I promised myself I would treat it with care. I planted flowers for the bees. I kept a small garden for myself. I even built a bench under the big oak tree because my grandpa used to sit there and tell stories about being brave and kind. One morning, while I watered my plants, I saw a little boy standing near the fence. His clothes were dirty. His face looked tired. He was holding a broken toy car. "Hey," I said softly. "You okay?" He looked up at me, scared at first, then whispered. The HOA man yelled at me. I frowned. "Why?" The boy swallowed hard. "Because I was playing near the sidewalk. He said kids shouldn't make noise outside during quiet hours. But I wasn't even being loud." I put down my watering can and walked to him slowly. "What's your name?" "Eli," he said. "Well, Eli," I told him, "you are welcome to sit on my bench anytime. Kids should laugh and play. That's just what kids do." His face brightened like someone turned on a light inside him. That was the first time I realized something was wrong with this HOA. Really wrong. They weren't protecting the neighborhood. They were controlling it. A week later, I saw the same HOA officer yelling at an old woman who lived 2 houses down. She was carrying groceries, heavy bags, too heavy for someone her age. "You can't leave your trash cans out longer than 7 minutes after pickup," he snapped. "It's just been," she tried to explain. "I don't care," he barked. "We have rules." Her hands shook so badly that one of the bags ripped, and apples rolled everywhere. I rushed over to help her, even though the officer glared at me like I had broken some secret law. "Thank you, dear," the old woman whispered. "No problem," I said, smiling gently. Kindness doesn't cost anything. But from that moment, I noticed something. Every time I helped someone, every time I stood up for someone, every time I showed kindness, the HOA officers watched me more closely. Like they were waiting for a reason to jump. Like they didn't want anyone challenging their power. It wasn't long before they found their reason. One sunny morning, 3 HOA officers marched onto the edge of my land without asking. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They didn't even wave. They just walked in. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "Can I help you?" One of them held up a clipboard. "We're issuing you an HOA compliance notice." "For what?" I asked. "For having a fence that is too brown." I blinked. "Too brown?" "Yes," the officer said. "Our color guidelines clearly state that all fences must be light brown. Yours is dark brown." I stared at them. Surely this had to be a joke. "I didn't join your HOA," I said slowly. "This land isn't part of your neighborhood." The officer looked annoyed. "Actually, it is. You're on the border, and the HOA rules apply to the whole area." "No," I said again. "This land isn't yours to control. My grandpa's documents say so." The officers exchanged looks. Then they smiled. Not friendly smiles. Smug smiles. "Well," one said, "we'll just have to double-check that." And from that moment on, the trouble began growing like a storm. They started showing up every other day. One officer would walk around my yard without asking. Another would take pictures of my house from the street. Sometimes they would leave notes claiming I owed them money for made-up violations. I ignored them at first, because that's what my grandpa would have done. He always said, "Never let angry people steal your peace." And for a while, things weren't too bad. But one evening, everything changed. I caught two HOA officers trying to enter my land through the side gate. "Stop right there!" I yelled. They froze. One of them forced a smile. "We're just checking something." "You don't check anything on my land," I said firmly. "Not without permission." They left, whispering to each other. And that's when I knew. They weren't going to stop. Not unless I made them stop. But even I didn't know how far they would go. And I definitely didn't know that things would soon explode into the moment where I would stand behind my gate, staring them down, and say the words that made them lose their minds. My land, my rules. And now, something big was about to happen. Something that would shake everything. Something that would become the next extreme event. But before we get there, where are you watching from? The next morning after the officers tried sneaking through my side gate, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something in between, like the air was squeezing around me, warning me that trouble was coming fast. My grandpa always said, "When the birds go quiet, listen. Something is about to change." And that morning, the birds were silent. I stepped outside and checked the gate. The lock was still in place, but the dirt under it was disturbed, like someone had tried pushing tools beneath the bars. It wasn't a raccoon. It wasn't the wind. It was them. The HOA officers were getting bolder. They weren't just watching anymore. They were planning something. I walked to my garden to calm myself. The sun warmed my face, the flowers swayed gently, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. That's when I saw Eli, the little boy from before, standing awkwardly near the fence, with his broken toy car held tight in his hands. "Hey, kiddo," I said, smiling. "Rough day?" He nodded, eyes downcast. The HOA man yelled at me again. My heart sank. For what this time? For walking too fast on the sidewalk? He said quietly. He said it looked like I was running, and running is not allowed near the HOA office. I exhaled slowly. This wasn't just silly anymore. This was cruel. I kneeled beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Eli, remember what I told you. You are allowed to be a kid. Don't let anyone take that from you." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw tears forming. "I wish everyone was nice like you." Those words hit me harder than anything the HOA had done. It reminded me why kindness matters, why standing up matters, why people need someone brave enough to say no. "Come on," I said gently. "Let's fix your toy car." We sat on my bench under the oak tree, and I screwed the wheels back into place. Eli laughed when it started rolling again. His smile warmed the whole yard. But that softness didn't last long, because as soon as he ran home, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. 3 HOA officers stood at the edge of my land again. No greeting, no smile, no respect. "We need to talk," the first one said. I crossed my arms. "About what now?" "We've reviewed your property lines," another officer said, "and we believe your land falls under our authority." I raised an eyebrow. "Believe?" "Yes," he answered sharply, "and while we confirm the final paperwork, we need full access to your property for inspection." "No," I said calmly. The first officer's face turned red. "You don't have a choice." I replied. "This is private land. You don't come in unless I let you." "We can fine you," the second officer warned. "Fine me for what?" I asked. "For existing?" The third officer stepped closer. "Look, just open the gate tomorrow morning so we can get this done." I shook my head slowly. "No, I'm not opening anything." They stared at me like I had just flipped their entire world upside down. After a few seconds of pure shock, they walked away, whispering angrily. I didn't know what they were whispering about. I didn't know what they were planning. But I knew one thing. Tomorrow was going to be a big day. The next morning came too fast. I woke up before the sun, feeling like a storm was sitting on my chest. I heard the crunch of gravel outside my gate, many footsteps, many voices. The HOA officers didn't come alone this time. I walked to the gate and looked through the bars. 5 of them. 5 HOA officers standing right outside. Clipboards, cameras, angry faces. They looked like they were preparing for war. One officer stepped forward and slammed his fist on the metal. "Open this gate right now." "No," I said. "You're required to follow HOA procedures," he snapped. "My land, my rules," I replied. That was the moment everything exploded. The officers shouted over each other. One kicked the gate. Another raised his clipboard like he was trying to scare me. Someone yelled something about legal force. They looked like they wanted to tear the gate off with their bare hands. But I didn't move. I didn't shake. I didn't say another word. Their anger filled the air like smoke. Their frustration cracked like lightning. And just when I thought they would finally give up, One of the officers suddenly stepped back, pulled out his phone, and made a call. The others went silent. I watched him carefully as he nodded, then whispered something I couldn't hear. His eyes lifted, cold and determined, and he said words that made my stomach twist. "All right, send them in." Them? Who was them? What was coming? What had they done? That chilling question hung in the air like a shadow. The moment those words left the officer's mouth, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Send them in. Who were they? My mind raced. Was this some sort of security team? Private enforcers? Or something worse? I gripped the gate tightly, feeling the metal dig into my palms. But I refused to show fear. My grandpa always said, bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's facing it anyway. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my chest. Then I heard it. A low rumble, almost like the growl of an angry bear. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, shaking the ground beneath me. I glanced down my long driveway and my jaw dropped. A huge truck, black as midnight, rolled slowly onto my land. Behind it, smaller vehicles followed, all with tinted windows. They weren't walking onto my property, they were driving in like they owned it. The HOA officers outside the gate looked satisfied, like they were watching the opening act of a play they had already written. But I wasn't a character in anyone's play. I was the author of my own story. I shouted, my voice echoing across the yard. "You do not come onto my land." The officers smirked. One of them lifted his arm. "Sir, we are authorized." I said no, I yelled, louder this time. My heart pounded, but I felt a strange calm underneath it all. This wasn't just about me. It was about every little voice the HOA had tried to silence. Every kid told to stay quiet. Every neighbor bullied over some meaningless rule. Every person who had ever been told, "You must obey because we said so." Then the truck stopped. A man in dark clothes stepped out, holding a clipboard like he was the captain of a ship. His face was unreadable behind his sunglasses. The officers whispered nervously among themselves. Whatever this man said, they clearly respected or feared him. He approached the gate. "Open the gate," he said calmly, but there was an edge in his voice that made the officers flinch. "I can't do that," I said. "This is my property, my land, my rules." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, without another word, he walked over to the lock. He pulled out a strange device, something like a high-tech key, and crouched down. I felt my chest tighten. Every instinct screamed at me to stop him. But then something strange happened. A memory flashed in my mind. My grandpa's words. "Sometimes the hardest fight is the one you don't fight with fists." I took a step back and didn't move. My eyes never left him. My fingers tightened on the gate, ready to swing it open if he dared to break it. The man worked silently for a few seconds, then straightened up and looked me in the eye. "Done," he said simply. My stomach dropped. The lock clicked. The gate shuddered. My land, my fortress, was no longer secure. The HOA officers grinned like predators. "Now we can inspect," one said, stepping forward. That's when something inside me snapped, not in anger, not in fear, but in clarity. I realized that they had underestimated me. They thought I would panic. They thought I would beg. They thought I would bow. I straightened my shoulders and spoke slowly, deliberately. "You walk onto my land, and everything you try to do, you will do under my eyes. And if anything happens to my home, my plants, my animals, you will answer to me." The officers froze. The man with the clipboard tilted his head slightly. Something in my voice, my calm, my certainty, made them hesitate. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. You could feel it, the electricity of a storm right before it hits. Then, without warning, the man with the clipboard stepped back and waved at the truck. From it, two more men in dark uniforms jumped out. They moved with precision, almost silently. The HOA officers started whispering frantically, clearly nervous now. Whatever this team was, it wasn't just about rules or fines. And that's when I saw it. A small, black drone lifted from the truck and hovered over my yard, its camera lens glinting in the morning sun. They weren't just entering my property. They were documenting every inch of it, every tree, every flower, every stone, every corner of my home. I clenched my fists and whispered to myself, "Not today." The tension was unbearable. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum. And then, with a sudden motion, the man with the clipboard signaled, and the drone zipped toward the gate. I stepped forward, placing myself directly between the drone and my home. "Stop." My voice shook just slightly, but it carried. The officers outside started shouting. The drone swerved slightly, then hovered again, scanning. I could see their frustration growing. They thought technology would intimidate me. They thought this would break me. It didn't. And that was the moment, the exact moment, when everything escalated into a situation none of us could have predicted. Because right as I stood there, blocking the drone, I heard a loud crash from the side of the property. Something had toppled over a stack of old lumber near the barn. The noise echoed, startling the officers and the men from the truck alike. Everyone froze. The air was so thick with suspense, you could have cut it with a knife. And at that moment, I realized this was just the beginning. Whatever they had planned, I wasn't going to let them control it, not without a fight. The crash from the side of the property echoed like a gunshot. Dust rose into the air, and a few birds took flight from the trees in alarm. I froze, my eyes darting toward the barn where the lumber had fallen. It wasn't just the noise, it was the timing. Everything seemed calculated, like someone was testing me, trying to see if I would flinch. But I didn't. I couldn't. The HOA officers outside the gate muttered angrily among themselves. The men in black uniforms from the truck looked tense, their movements sharp and careful. Even the drone hovered in place, circling above the barn like it had sensed the chaos. For a moment, the world felt suspended, like the entire morning had stopped just to watch what I would do next. I took a step toward the barn, keeping my gaze on the officers. "Stay back," I warned. "This is my property." They didn't move. They thought I was bluffing. I wasn't. I never bluff. Not when it comes to my land. Not when it comes to my rules. Eli's laughter from yesterday echoed in my mind. His small voice reminded me why I had to stand firm, why I couldn't let bullies, no matter how many of them or how powerful they appeared, decide what happened here. I swallowed hard and focused. My grandpa's words came back to me again. Bravery is quiet. It's calm. It's watching the storm without losing yourself. I reached the barn. Dust coated the floor, and the stack of lumber had fallen across the doorway. But it wasn't empty. A small movement caught my eye, something that made my stomach tighten. A raccoon, probably startled by the noise, darted out and disappeared into the trees. My relief was almost immediate. This wasn't an attack. Not yet. Then I turned back toward the gate. The officers had regrouped. One of them had taken out a notepad and began scribbling furiously, while another spoke into a phone. Their body language said everything. I could see the frustration, the anger, the confusion. They hadn't expected me to stay calm. They hadn't expected me to be ready. I walked slowly toward the driveway, keeping my hands visible. I wanted them to see I wasn't afraid. I wanted them to understand that intimidation wouldn't work here. Not today. Not ever. "You're wasting your time," I said quietly but firmly. "Nothing you do here will make me open that gate." The man with the clipboard from the truck stepped forward again. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. "We can wait," he said. "We have ways to make sure compliance happens." "I don't care about your ways," I said. "I care about my land, my family's legacy, my rules. That's what matters." The drone buzzed above, shining a small red light that tracked my movements. The officers whispered among themselves, clearly unsure of what to do next. One of the HOA men muttered something that I didn't quite hear. Another gestured at the truck, and I noticed movement inside. The doors were opening. More men were stepping out. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Every instinct in my body told me to prepare for a confrontation, but my mind reminded me, panic was the enemy. Bravery wasn't rushing blindly. Bravery was strategy, patience, and clarity. I walked back to the gate and placed my hand firmly on the metal. "If you come onto my property," I said, locking eyes with the man holding the clipboard, "you do it knowing that you are not welcome. Every inch of this land is watched, every action is noticed, and every misstep will have consequences." For a moment, they all hesitated. I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. For a brief second, the officers weren't bullies anymore. They were unsure. They were human. But just as I thought I had bought a little time, the quiet was broken again. A sudden, sharp sound rang out from the back of the property, like wood splintering or metal bending. Something large had fallen or been dropped, and this time it wasn't the raccoon. I spun toward the noise. My heart raced. The barn? The trees? My garden? I couldn't tell at first, but I could hear the officers gasp in alarm. They hadn't expected it. None of them had. I realized instantly that whatever had happened was going to escalate the situation. Whatever this new extreme event was, it wasn't something they had planned. And just like that, the calm before the storm was gone. I took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next, and stepped closer to the gate. My eyes scanned the driveway. The truck, the men, the drone, they were all there, waiting, poised for action. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Not today. Not on my land. And then I saw it, something moving just beyond the trees, a shadow bigger than the raccoon, bigger than any animal that should be there. Its size and speed made my stomach drop. The officers outside gasped and stumbled back, whispering urgently to each other. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. Because I knew, deep down, that the next moment was going to change everything. The shadow moved quickly through the trees, and I could barely make out its shape. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer startled by the commotion. But as it drew closer, my stomach twisted. This wasn't a deer. It was something bigger. Something human. Or maybe more than human. My eyes widened as I realized the figure was running straight toward the barn where the lumber had fallen. The HOA officers outside the gate froze. They whispered to each other nervously, pointing and gesturing. The man with the clipboard barked something at them, but his voice sounded small, weak even, against the tension in the air. For the first time, I felt the balance of power shift. They had all come thinking they were in control, but now I wasn't sure who was watching whom. I gripped the gate tighter. My knuckles turned white. "Stay behind me," I muttered under my breath, though I was alone except for the distant sound of my garden birds beginning to stir again. I didn't want to show fear, but my pulse was hammering. The figure burst into the clearing near the barn. My breath caught in my throat. It was one of the HOA officers, or at least it looked like one, but he was being dragged backward by something massive and unseen. His arms flailed, and he screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the crashing of the fallen lumber as it shifted violently. I wanted to run. My legs shook, but I forced myself to stay. This was my land. I had to protect it. The other officers started moving too, stepping away from the gate, their confidence gone. The men from the truck looked panicked. The drone wavered in the air, its red light scanning frantically. I could feel their fear sharp and sudden, like a gust of wind cutting through a quiet forest. Then I saw it clearly. A huge, metal gate they had brought in one of the trucks had collapsed on its side as if someone or something had shoved it. The impact sent dust flying, and the ground shook. The shadow that had attacked the officer seemed almost supernatural in its speed and force. I couldn't understand it. I froze for a second. Then my eyes caught something else movement near the trees lining the driveway. Eli! The boy had sneaked out, curious about the commotion, and now he was frozen in place, staring wide-eyed. My stomach clenched. Eli! I shouted, waving my arms. He ducked behind a tree, trembling. My heart ached for him. I knew this was getting too dangerous, but I also knew that I couldn't let fear rule me. I had to stay calm. I had to stay strong. That was the only way I could protect him, my land, and myself. The officer being dragged scrambled free, coughing and gasping. He stumbled forward, face pale. The other officers shouted at him to get back, but it was too late. Whatever had caused the collapse was moving again, faster than I could track. The air seemed charged, almost electric, as the trees swayed violently in a sudden gust of wind. I clenched my fists. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, but I forced myself to speak aloud, to remind everyone, including myself, who was in control. This is my land. You don't decide what happens here. I do. The man with the clipboard stepped forward again, but even he hesitated. Something in the air had shifted. Whatever power or authority he believed he had seemed fragile now. The men from the truck whispered frantically into their phones, clearly trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I realized then that my land had always been more than just soil and trees. It was alive. Every flower, every stone, every tree seemed to respond to me, to my presence, to my courage. And now it was protecting me in ways I had never imagined. The shadow paused, as if sensing my determination. For a split second, I could see the outline clearly. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't one of them. It was something else entirely, moving with intent, powerful, unstoppable. And then, just as I thought I might have a moment to plan my next move, the shadow lunged again, this time toward the men from the truck. Screams filled the air. Dust and debris flew everywhere. The officers outside the gate stumbled backward in panic. The drone lost its balance and crashed into the dirt with a loud bang. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The chaos was overwhelming, but I felt a strange calm. This was my land. I had protected it once, and I would do it again. And then I realized something terrifying. Whatever was happening now wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The extreme events were escalating, and the fight for my land was far from over. The chaos was deafening. Screams, crashing wood, and the sound of tires skidding across the gravel driveway filled the air. I could barely see through the cloud of dust, but I knew I had to act. My land was under attack not just by the HOA officers, but by whatever force had toppled the truck gate and sent the lumber flying. My instincts screamed at me to move, to protect, to fight. I stepped forward, raising my arms to try and shield my home. "Stay back!" I shouted. "This is my land, my rules." The officers outside the gate hesitated. They were no longer confident, no longer smug. Their authority had been broken in an instant. Some of them were shouting orders into phones, their voices frantic, while others just stared, wide-eyed and pale, as if the morning had turned into a nightmare they weren't prepared for. I took a deep breath and scanned the yard. The lumber had shifted, forming a barricade in front of the barn. The shadow was gone, or maybe it had merged with the chaos. I couldn't tell. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was real and what was imagined. Then I heard a faint cry. My head snapped toward the sound. "Eli!" The little boy had slipped past my warnings and was frozen near the edge of the trees, looking terrified. My chest tightened. I couldn't let him get hurt. I sprinted toward him, dodging debris and fallen branches. Every step felt heavier than the last, but I forced myself forward. "Eli!" I shouted again, reaching out. "Run to me!" He hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, but something in my voice, calm yet firm, pulled him forward. He sprinted toward me, stumbling over the uneven ground. I caught him, holding him tight for a moment. "It's okay," I whispered. "You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." The officers outside were moving again, but slower this time. They seemed unsure, almost fearful, like they had no idea what to do next. The men from the truck were scrambling, trying to regain control, but the shadow, or whatever it was, had vanished. It was like it had disappeared into the trees, leaving only destruction behind. I turned back to the barn. The stack of lumber had shifted again, threatening to fall further. My hands itched to move it, to secure it, but I knew I couldn't, not yet. Not with the officers and men still lingering, watching, waiting. They didn't belong here. This was my property, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of taking control. I realized then that everything I had done, the kindness to Eli, helping my neighbors, standing up to the HOA officers before, had led to this moment. I wasn't just protecting my land, I was protecting a principle, a belief that people have the right to live freely on their own property, without fear, without intimidation. The man with the clipboard approached the gate cautiously. "Sir," he said, his voice lower this time, almost hesitant. "We just want to inspect." I shook my head slowly. "You've already seen enough. You don't get to come onto my land without permission. Not today. Not ever." His eyes flicked toward the truck, then back to me. I could see the uncertainty. Even he knew something had changed. The confidence they had brought with them that morning was gone. It had been replaced by hesitation, by fear. I glanced at Eli, who was holding onto my hand tightly. "It's okay," I whispered. "Everything is going to be fine. Just stay close to me." The drone buzzed above, but it was off balance, struggling to maintain altitude after its crash. I noticed the camera lens waver as if it couldn't focus. They were losing control, and I could feel it. And then, just as I thought the worst might be over, a new sound cut through the chaos, a loud, metallic crash from the far side of the property. I turned my head sharply. A large tree limb had broken and slammed into the driveway, crushing a set of orange cones and scattering debris across the yard. The impact was so powerful it sent a shiver through the ground. The officers and men from the truck jumped back, startled. The shadow, or whatever force had been moving, was back. This time it was bolder, more aggressive. The air seemed charged, almost electric, as if the land itself was pushing back against the intruders. I clenched my fists, feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. My heart pounded, but my mind was clear. This was my land, my home, my rules, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away. I looked at Eli and whispered, "Hold on tight. Whatever happens next, we face it together." The metallic crash echoed through my property like a warning bell. Dust swirled in the air, and branches shook as if the land itself was trembling. The officers outside the gate stumbled backward, their faces pale and their confident postures gone. Even the men from the truck looked uncertain, glancing at each other as though searching for someone to blame. The drone wobbled in the sky, its red light scanning frantically, but I could tell it was struggling to stay steady. I tightened my grip on Eli's hand, keeping him close. "Stay behind me," I whispered, more to reassure myself than him. His small fingers were cold against mine, and his eyes were wide with fear. "You're safe," I added. I won't let anything happen to you." The shadow had vanished again, but its presence lingered. Something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the chaos of the fallen lumber or the branch smashing into the driveway. It was as if the land itself had come alive to defend itself. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. Calmness was my weapon. Fear was theirs. The man with the clipboard stepped forward cautiously, his hands slightly raised. "Sir," he said, his voice lower than before, "we just need to finish the inspection. There's no reason to escalate this." I shook my head, my jaw tight. "You don't get to walk onto my land without my permission. My land, my rules, that hasn't changed. Not today." He glanced toward the truck, then back at me. I could see hesitation in his eyes, a crack in the armor of authority he had worn all morning. The other officers whispered frantically to each other, glancing at the fallen lumber and the tipped branch, clearly unsure how to proceed. They had come thinking they were in control, but now, they weren't even sure of themselves. A sudden movement from the trees caught my attention. I froze. Something, or someone, was approaching, fast. Not running, but moving with precision, like a shadow slipping across the yard. I could see the outline now, large, strong, and moving with intent. My stomach tightened. Eli tugged at my hand, sensing the tension. "Don't let go," I said firmly, gripping him tighter. The shadow reached the clearing, and I realized with shock that it was another officer, or at least dressed like one, but something was different. The way he moved, the speed, the force, it wasn't normal. He stumbled briefly over a small branch, then corrected himself, almost like he had been propelled forward. The other officers gasped and scrambled backward, whispering urgent instructions into their phones. I took a deep breath and stepped toward them, keeping Eli close. "If you step onto this land, you do it knowing I am watching every move," I said calmly. "Every inch of my property is mine, and every action will have consequences." The shadow paused, as if sensing my resolve. I could feel it in the air. A strange tension, a silent acknowledgement that I was not afraid. My heart raced, but my mind was clear. I wasn't just defending land. I was defending freedom, respect, and every small act of kindness I had extended to people like Eli. The drone buzzed overhead again, trying to regain balance. But its red light wavered, scanning the yard like it couldn't process what it was seeing. The men from the truck were whispering rapidly, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, the shadow lunged again, this time toward the truck. Metal screeched as it clipped the edge of the vehicle. Tires spun on the gravel. One officer screamed, and another dropped his clipboard, scrambling to pick it up. I stepped forward, planting my feet firmly in the dirt. "Leave now!" I shouted. "This is my land, my rules, my home." The officers froze. The men from the truck hesitated, and the shadow paused, mid-motion. For a moment, everything was still, suspended in tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I glanced at Eli, who was clinging to me. His small body trembled, but his eyes were wide and alert. "We're okay," I whispered. "Just hold on." And then it happened, the extreme event that would mark the climax of this part of the story. A branch from the old oak tree cracked loudly and fell toward the driveway, missing the truck by inches. Dust and splinters flew everywhere. The force of it knocked one of the officers off balance, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The shadow disappeared again, vanishing into the trees. The officers scrambled to regroup, but the tension in their movements betrayed their fear. Even the man with the clipboard stepped back, unsure, hesitant, and suddenly far less commanding than he had been that morning. I stood there, breathing hard, but feeling a surge of calm determination. My land had held, my rules had held, and I knew, deep down, that whatever came next, I wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. The morning air was thick with tension, still buzzing from the previous day's chaos. The fallen branch lay across the driveway like a warning, a reminder that my land was alive in ways the HOA officers could never understand. Dust still hung in the air, clinging to the leaves and the grass, and the smell of earth and wood was strong after the disturbance. Eli clung to my side, trembling slightly but trusting me enough to stay close. I knew I had to stay calm. The officers outside the gate were regrouping, whispering rapidly to one another. Their confident postures had crumbled. I could see it in their faces, the uncertainty, the frustration, the faint flicker of fear. For once, they weren't in control. I had shifted the balance without even touching them. "Stay behind me," I said to Eli. His small hand fit into mine like it had always been meant to. He nodded silently, eyes wide but determined. The man with the clipboard took a cautious step forward, "Sir," he said, his voice almost apologetic, "we can resolve this peacefully. You don't need to escalate." I shook my head. "There is no escalation. You don't belong here. My land, my rules. That hasn't changed." My voice was calm but firm. Every word carried weight, and I could see them registering it. For the first time, they weren't just being defied, they were being reminded that their authority had limits. The drone wobbled above, trying to maintain altitude, but it was obvious it was struggling. The red light scanned the yard erratically, unable to focus on anything. I felt a quiet satisfaction at this small victory. Technology and intimidation could only go so far. True power lay in resolve. I turned toward the barn. The stack of lumber had shifted slightly during the night, and I knew it could collapse further if I wasn't careful. But I had learned something important yesterday. Fear didn't control the land. Calm, steady hands and careful decisions did. I moved slowly, adjusting the pieces just enough to prevent them from falling while keeping Eli safely to my side. Then, a new sound shattered the fragile quiet. A loud metallic thud from the edge of the trees. My heart skipped. The shadow, or whatever force had been moving through the property, was back. This time, it wasn't subtle. Its presence was impossible to ignore. I could feel the air vibrating around me, the tension growing like a storm about to break. The officers outside the gate froze again. Their whispered instructions had turned into frantic murmurs. I could see one of them pull out a phone, presumably calling for backup. Another shook his head, as if trying to convince himself that this was all just an accident, a trick of the light. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders. This land, my home, wasn't just soil and trees. It was a legacy. My grandpa had built it with care, tended it with love, and I had inherited not just the property, but the responsibility to protect it. Every flower, every tree, every stone was part of that legacy. And I wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how many officers or trucks they brought, take it from me. Eli tugged at my sleeve. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I knelt to his level and held his shoulders gently. "It's nothing we can't handle. Stay calm. Hold my hand. We'll get through this." Just as I finished speaking, movement erupted from the trees. A figure, or more accurately, a silhouette darted into the clearing. It was fast, almost impossibly so. I barely had time to register what I was seeing before it collided with a small tree, knocking branches to the ground. The officers shouted in alarm, their panic rising. I realized then that the extreme event wasn't over. It was escalating. Whatever force or entity was moving through my property wasn't just testing me anymore. It was bold, aggressive, and relentless. The drone's red light spun wildly as it tried to track the movement, clearly overwhelmed. I held Eli closer. "No matter what happens," I said, "we stay together. We stay calm. We stay strong." The man with the clipboard hesitated at the gate, his authority completely shattered. He glanced at the chaos with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Even the other officers were frozen, unable to respond. They had underestimated the situation, underestimated me, underestimated the land itself. Then, with a sudden, sharp crack, another branch broke from the oak tree near the barn. It landed heavily in the yard, startling everyone. The shadow moved again, darting behind the fallen lumber, and the ground seemed to shake slightly beneath our feet. I gritted my teeth, feeling the surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. This was a test of will, courage, and perseverance. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The extreme event had reached a new height. Dust, shadows, crashing wood, it all coalesced into a moment so intense it felt like the land itself was alive and defending me. And in that moment, I realized the next move I made could change everything. The ground shook beneath my feet as the old oak creaked violently. Dust swirled around us, filling the air with the sharp, earthy scent of upturned soil and broken wood. Eli clung to my side, his small body trembling. But I refused to let fear take over. I had to stay steady, not just for myself, but for him. This land had always been my sanctuary, my inheritance, and now it was under siege. I would not yield. The shadow moved again, faster than I could track. It darted behind the fallen lumber near the barn, knocking pieces of wood in every direction. The crash was deafening, splintering into smaller noises as the planks struck the ground. The officers at the gate flinched in unison, whispering urgently to each other. Even the men from the truck looked panicked, clearly unsure what to do. Their authority had been shattered in mere moments, replaced by raw, unfiltered fear. "Stay behind me," I whispered to Eli, gripping his hand firmly. His tiny fingers were cold but determined, refusing to let go. "No matter what happens, stay calm. We'll get through this together." The man with the clipboard tried to regain control, stepping cautiously forward. "Sir," he said, his voice quivering slightly, "you don't need to escalate this. We can leave if you—" "Leave?" I interrupted, my voice calm but edged with steel. "You came onto my property uninvited. My land, my rules. You have no authority here. You never did. And I am not afraid of you." He hesitated, his confident posture crumbling further. I could see the panic rising in his eyes. The other officers whispered into phones, but their voices were trembling. They had miscalculated everything. They had assumed fear would bend me. They were wrong. The drone above hovered, unstable, the red lights spinning like a warning. I realized the technology they relied on had failed them. They had brought machines to intimidate me, but the machines were powerless against the chaos on the ground. Then, a new sound cut sharply through the noise, a loud snap, followed by the cracking of heavy wood. I turned just in time to see another branch of the old oak splinter, falling toward the driveway with terrifying speed. My heart leapt. Eli's eyes were wide with fear. I lunged forward, grabbing him and pulling him to safety just as the branch slammed into the dirt, sending dust and splinters into the air. The shadow, or whatever it was, moved again, emerging from behind the fallen lumber. Its presence was imposing, almost unnatural. I could feel the energy in the air shift. The land itself seemed to hum with anticipation, reacting to my determination and the intruder's fear. I took a deep breath, keeping my focus sharp. "If anyone steps forward, they do it knowing I am watching every move," I said. "This is my property, my home, and you will not take it." The officers at the gate froze. Their whispers had grown frantic, but none of them dared approach. Even the men from the truck hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Their confidence had vanished, replaced by an uneasy awareness that this was bigger than them, bigger than the HOA rules, bigger than their authority. Eli tugged gently at my sleeve. "What is that?" he whispered, nodding toward the shadow. I knelt to his level. "I don't know exactly," I said, keeping my voice calm, "but it's not here to hurt us. It's testing us. We stay close, we stay calm, and we do not run." The shadow seemed to pause, as if sensing my resolve. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it dashed toward the side of the yard where the trucks were parked. Tires screeched, and one officer stumbled backward, shouting in alarm. The drone wavered dangerously before tipping sideways and crashing into the dirt with a sharp clang. I felt a surge of adrenaline but forced myself to breathe slowly, deliberately. This was my land. I had inherited it, I had nurtured it, and I had defended it against every challenge, small or large. Nothing, no force, no officer, no machine, could take it from me while I stood firm. And then, the extreme event hit again. A section of the barn's roof, loosened by the chaos, began to tilt and creak ominously. I caught the movement in the corner of my eye and dashed forward, pulling Eli with me just as the wooden beams groaned and fell to the ground, narrowly missing the truck. The officers scrambled, shouting and panicking, but their efforts were useless. The land itself had taken control, and I could only marvel at the force protecting me. I held Eli close, my chest heaving, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The extreme events were relentless, but my resolve had not wavered. I realized that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing firm in its presence, protecting what mattered most. The morning sun had risen higher, but it did little to chase away the tension lingering over the property. Dust and debris from the fallen branches still clung to the grass, and the shattered wood from the barn lay scattered like a warning. Eli stayed close, his small hand tucked into mine, trusting me completely despite the chaos surrounding us. I could feel his heart pounding against my chest, a mirror to my own, but I refused to let fear dictate our next move. The officers at the gate were silent now, whispering anxiously among themselves. Their confident, commanding presence had vanished completely. Even the man with the clipboard, who had seemed in control earlier, now looked uneasy, his calm facade cracking under the weight of uncertainty. The extreme events of the past hours had shaken them to the core. They had assumed authority could intimidate me. They had been wrong. The shadow, or whatever force had been moving through my land, was nowhere in sight, but its presence lingered. The air felt charged, alive, as if the land itself was waiting for me to make the next move. I glanced at the barn, the fallen lumber, and the old oak that had lost several branches. Each element of my property seemed like a silent guardian, reacting to the intruder's fear and my determination. "Eli," I whispered, crouching slightly so he could hear me clearly. We need to be careful. Watch every step. Stay close to me. Nothing that's happening is going to catch us off guard if we stay calm. He nodded solemnly, his eyes wide but alert. Are they going to come back? He asked, his small voice trembling. I don't know, I admitted, but we're ready if they do. Remember, courage isn't not being scared. It's standing firm, even when you are. The officers at the gate were moving again, but tentatively, this time. They were clearly debating among themselves, trying to figure out how to proceed without further confrontation. The men from the truck whispered into their phones, their urgency palpable, but even they were cautious now. Whatever had happened, the crashing branches, the shadow, the drone falling had shown them that my land was more than just property. It was a fortress, alive in its own way, and it responded to its owner. Then I heard a sharp cracking sound from the far side of the driveway. My pulse quickened. I turned slowly, scanning the yard. Another branch from the oak had snapped, sending shards of wood tumbling to the ground. The force of it rattled the trucks parked near the gate. The officers shouted in alarm, stepping backward, unsure of what to do. Even the drone, which had managed to right itself, wobbled dangerously before crashing again into the dirt. I held Eli close, my jaw set. This was escalating. The shadow, or whatever presence had been moving through the property, was growing bolder. It wasn't attacking directly, but the environment itself seemed to shift with its presence. Every branch that fell, every splintered piece of wood, every startled animal felt deliberate. Like the land was testing their courage, or theirs was being tested by it. I moved slowly toward the barn, adjusting the fallen lumber where I could while keeping Eli protected. We're okay, I whispered. Stay calm. Focus. Nothing is going to harm us if we're careful. The man with the clipboard stepped forward again, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Sir, we can negotiate. You don't need to escalate. Negotiation? I said, my voice calm but firm. You came onto my land uninvited. You broke my peace, my property, my rules. There is nothing to negotiate. You leave. Or you face the consequences of trespassing. He hesitated, glancing at the officers and then at the truck. The uncertainty in his eyes mirrored what I had seen in theirs. For the first time, authority was powerless against the resolve of the land and its owner. Suddenly, a loud, sharp crash echoed from the barn roof. I whipped my head toward the sound, my heart racing. A large section of the roof had loosened, the old timbers threatening to collapse. Dust and splinters filled the air as I moved instinctively, pulling Eli back. The officers outside jumped, shouting in alarm. But it was too late. The beam fell, crashing onto the ground, mere feet from where the trucks were parked. The shadow reappeared briefly, slipping between the barn and the trees, before vanishing again. The presence of it made the hair on my arms stand on end. Its energy was undeniable. I realized with a sinking feeling that the extreme events weren't slowing down, they were building, escalating in intensity with each passing minute. I looked down at Eli, his small face pale but determined. No matter what happens, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. We face it together. We stay strong, we stay calm, we protect this land, always. And in that moment, I understood that the true test wasn't just defending my property. It was proving that courage, calmness, and empathy could stand firm even when the odds seemed impossible. The air felt heavier than before, thick with dust and tension. Every sound echoed louder than it should have, like the land itself was holding its breath. Eli stood beside me, gripping my hand tightly. Even though he was scared, he didn't cry. He trusted me, and that alone kept me strong. The officers at the gate looked completely shaken. Gone were their proud stances, their stiff shoulders, their clipped voices. Now they looked like people who had wandered into something far bigger than they could understand. They huddled together, whispering urgently. Even the man with the clipboard who had strutted onto my land like a king looked lost. Everything around us had shifted. The crashing branches, the falling beams, the shadow racing between the trees. None of it was random. The land had spoken. It had reacted. And I knew deep inside that it had done so because I refused to bend. Because I protected it. Because I stood firm when someone tried to take what wasn't theirs. Eli tugged my sleeve gently. Are they gonna come in again? He asked, his voice trembling but brave. I knelt down and looked him straight in the eyes. They might try, I said. But we won't run, and we won't be afraid. We're not doing anything wrong. This land belongs to us. And kindness. Kindness even matters here. When you care for something, it cares for you back. That's why the land is waking up. It knows we're protecting it. He nodded. though I could see he didn't fully understand. But he believed me, and sometimes that was enough. I stood again, scanning the edge of the property. The shadow was gone, but its presence still buzzed faintly in the air, like a low hum from the trees. The officers seemed frozen. They didn't move closer, but they didn't leave either. They were stuck between fear and pride, unsure what to do. Finally, the man with the clipboard stepped forward again. But this time he moved slowly, like someone approaching a dangerous animal. "Look," he said, voice shaky. "We didn't mean for things to get this far. We need to get our inspection done. We're not trying to hurt anyone." I kept my voice calm, steady. "You crossed the line the moment you stepped onto my property without respect. If you had come kindly, if you had knocked politely, if you had asked, things would have been different, but you didn't. You tried to force your way in. And this land does not tolerate force." The clipboard man swallowed hard. He looked back at the falling branches, the crushed drone, the broken lumber, the trembling officers behind him. We can schedule another day," he murmured. "A day when you're ready. We'll come, respectfully." Eli squeezed my hand. I could feel his sudden hope. Even the land felt quieter, as if listening. I nodded slowly. Not because I wanted them back, but because kindness deserved a chance. "If you come respectfully," I said, "then you will be met with respect. But you will never threaten us again. Not on this land, not ever." He nodded quickly. "Understood." One of the younger officers stepped forward timidly. "Sir, if we can just leave now, we really would like to." I almost smiled. "You may." They didn't wait a second longer. They practically ran to their trucks, tripping over each other in their scramble. Engines roared to life. Doors slammed. The tires skidded against the dirt as they pulled away from my gate, fleeing like they'd seen a ghost. And just like that, silence settled. A deep, peaceful silence. Not heavy, not tense, just calm. Like the land finally let out the breath it had been holding. Eli turned to me, his eyes bright. "We did it?" I lifted him into my arms and hugged him tightly. "We did," I said. "Because we stayed calm, because we didn't fight with anger, because we stood for what was right. That's the real strength, Eli." The trees rustled gently, almost approvingly. A soft breeze swept across the yard, carrying the smell of earth and pine. The shadow was gone, its purpose fulfilled. I closed the gate slowly, locking it with steady hands. Not out of fear, but out of peace, out of finality, out of knowing that the land was safe again. Eli rested his head on my shoulder. "I'm glad this is home," he whispered. "So am I," I replied. "And it always will be, as long as we protect it, as long as we lead with kindness, as long as we remember my land, my rules, but also my heart." The sun broke through the clouds, warm and soft, touching the barn, the trees, and the old oak that had stood by us through everything. And with that sunlight, the story ended. Where are you watching from?